Hi again, it's Bob Knight with another exciting week of Florida history. By now you know the drill. We're all the way up into the 19th century, and this session will be all about the period of time between 1840 and 1926. When we left off, James Westcott and David Lee Buell just became our first U.S. Senator. This week's lesson is the Civil War, railroad men, and Napoleon Broward, 1845 to 1926. Now, was Florida active in the Civil War? And if so, what was our role? Did we send men to fight? And after the war, what was the key to our expansion as a state? Well, your lesson today is about railroad men, Flagler, and Plant, and also the most devastating fire ever to burn a southern city. And what city was that? We touch on the turn of the century, the roaring 20s, and the land booms of South Florida. This is one of the most valuable lessons we have of Florida. There was so much development in the 19th century. I think this is the most enlightening episode. So watch, and if you choose, there's a short quiz afterwards you can take. You're really gonna like this one. It's very interesting. How many people have learned something from this class that you didn't know before? 100%. That's great. You got to retain all this stuff. Remember, look, I told you all that you needed to take notes. I'm telling you, you need to retain this stuff because this is, for a lot of you, this is the only time you're ever going to hear it. And so these are all really good stories. I've got a few more stories for you. We left off during the Great Seminole War, 1835. And so we're moving into the 1840s. And so what happened in 1845? That's right. Florida finally became a state, the 27th state in the Union. And statehood in 1845 led to rapid growth in Florida during the antebellum years. From 1845 to 1860, the population doubled from 70,000 in the whole state to 140,000. Rapid growth, twice as many people in a 15-year period. Of the 140,000 that lived here during that period, 40%, or about 56,000, were enslaved people working in the cotton industry and the forest products. Cattle raising, Florida's oldest industry, grew into Hillsborough and Manatee and Polk counties, Orange County and Hernando County. And small railroad lines were born, and Florida was finally poised to take off as a healthy young state. Oh, but there was trouble brewing, wasn't there? There was a war on the horizon. Florida, along with the rest of the nation, would take one gigantic leap backwards. Was Florida active in the Civil War? Was it? How many people think it was? How many people think it wasn't? Well, it was. Florida's role in the Civil War was to be the breadbasket for the South. Florida's involvement in the Civil War started in 1860. November of 1860, shortly after Lincoln was elected president. Mass rallies took place in many Florida towns to protest the expected Republican assault on the institution of slavery. "We say resist," declared the Fernandina East Florida newspaper. Both houses of the legislature unanimously passed a bill calling for the ordinance of secession. And so, the independent nation of Florida withdrew from the American Union in January 1861. It was the third state to do so. What were the first two states? South Carolina is correct. Come get a... Yeah, you. And who else? No. Virginia was one of the last. No. Nope. I heard it over here somewhere. Who said Mississippi? Okay, come get one. Yeah, you. And we were very enthusiastic about seceding from the Union. And so the Confederacy was formed, and Florida would live under its fifth flag. Spain, then France, then the British, then the United States of America, and now the Confederate States of America. Well, secession at the time was a very popular decision. News of secession just 15 years after becoming a state was met throughout Florida with torchlight processions and bonfires and bells ringing in churches, full celebration. Well, military action started right away. Federal troops moved quickly to fortify their positions throughout the South at arsenals and forts from Key West to Pensacola. In fact, instead of the war beginning at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, the Civil War almost began at Fort Pickens in Pensacola Bay. Now, Fort Pickens sits on the western edge of Santa Rosa Island and Pensacola Bay, a very strategic spot. It's a massive structure with over 100 big guns completed in 1834, and it has 22 million bricks. It's one of the largest structures in Florida. It is the largest of several fortifications to protect Pensacola, along with Fort Barracas, Fort McRae, and of course, the Pensacola Naval Yard. You see, the idea of having multiple forts at the entrance of the bay, they're designed to trap approaching ships in a crossfire, should any of them be brave enough to attempt to enter the bay. And there are systems like that all up and down the east coast of the United States. One of the heroes of the Civil War for the North was Colonel Adam Slimmer, who successfully denied the Confederates access to the fort when the war started. He had vision, and without orders, he understood what to do. As the first shots of the war were fired on January the 10th, 1861, the Florida militia moved in on its own volition. Slimmer spiked the guns at Fort Barracas, destroyed 20,000 tons of gunpowder to deny it to the Southern forces, and moved all the Union forces and all the supplies to Fort Pickens that could be fortified and easily defended. The Confederate attack of the fort was easily repelled with Pickett's big guns, and the South never again made an effort to take Pensacola. Slimmer saved the fort and the Union interests in Florida. Then, just days later, on April 12th, 1861, state troops in South Carolina fired on Fort Sumter, which is in the middle of that bay. Fort Pickens would remain in federal hands throughout the war. And actually, Fort Pickens in Pensacola would serve as the federal headquarters in Florida throughout the war. The federal strategy for Florida during the Civil War was to control the coast, from Pensacola all the way to Jacksonville. Control of the coast, all of its forts, the harbors, and the ports. After all, the population generally lived near the coast. The North believed that by controlling the coast and the ports, it could control Confederate supplies. So in the pursuit of a blockade, for example, Jacksonville was attacked 4 different times, twice by the North, twice by the South to take it back. And for a while, food stocks and ammunition shipments were down. But then, Florida discovered a local art form: blockade running. Rebel vessels of all shapes and sizes successfully made passage from Havana and the British Bahamas with cargoes of supplies bound for Florida's countless bays, inlets, rivers, and waterways. On the return trip, boats would take cotton and turpentine. General Robert E. Lee, the eventual commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, actually personally made 2 wartime trips to Florida, both to Fernandina. Lee personally devised a plan. Can I have the Union hat? There you go. Lee personally devised the plan which determined the role that Florida would play in the Civil War. You see, the Confederate strategy was to hold the interiors of Florida. It was critical to the Confederacy that Florida's food-producing farmlands and its cattle ranches be protected. "We'll let them have the coastline," bellowed Lee in a meeting with leaders of Florida at Fernandina Beach. "The most valuable asset now," he said, "is the beef." And at one point, cattle were being driven north at a rate of 600 head a week. That's a lot of beef. It was the only thing that kept the troops and most of the South fed during the war. And that's how Florida played its role as the breadbasket of the Confederacy. Now, the other precious commodity that we had to offer was salt, used to preserve the meat and also tan the hides for making leather. The principal salt works were in Apalachee Bay and St. Andrew Bays. Anybody here from Panama City? Yep. If you go down to the coast, Panama City Beach, imagine all kinds of salt works on that coast because we could make salt from water. And men, what they would do is they would boil water in these huge kettles, like you see here. It was already a known system for making salt worldwide, and it was easy to make. The men would boil salt in these huge kettles and then let the water evaporate and end up with thick flakes of salt that they could move around from place to place and salt the beef to protect it. Union blockade squadrons sought out and destroyed the salt works because, especially at night, the gunboats could see the fires on the coastline all up and down the panhandle. And so blockade squadrons would destroy those salt works from time to time. But as you can imagine, it's just a fire and some giant kettles. And so the installations were able to be quickly rebuilt. So salt and beef remained in flow to the north throughout the war. And so almost all battles and skirmishes fought in Florida took place in the interior and generally were Union attacks on southern food-producing regions. The North had to stop the supplies going north. And so, in 1864, stopping food and munitions flowing north to beleaguered Southern troops was a critical Union objective. It was the whole reason that the Northern troops would be in Florida, and ultimately led to the Battle of Olustee. Anybody heard of the Battle of Olustee? Where is it? Who said that? Come get one. You're right. The Battle of Olustee happened on February the 20th, 1864. Towards the very end of the war, when the Union was trying to stop our supplies from flowing north. They could win the war a lot easier without supplies from us flowing north. I want everybody to think about going to Olustee's reenactment, which they have every year, on or near February 20th. It's an anniversary every year, and they do an entire reenactment for both sides, the Federals and the Southerners. And it was really the only single major engagement of the Civil War here in Florida. And it's just east of Lake City. not very far from Jacksonville, within marching distance of Jacksonville. So here's what happened. At the time, the Union controlled Jacksonville. And you can see it here. Jacksonville, way on the right side of the map. Olustee is just east of Lake City. So here's what happened. 5,500 proud Union troops organized, got together, and they marched out of Jacksonville on February the 20th, 1864, on the way to the rail junction at Olustee Station. Now, Olustee railroad tracks are still there, and that's where they met. They were actually surprised when they got there by 5,200 well-equipped Confederate forces in division strength with cavalry and cannon. And they were led by a guy by the name of Joseph Finnegan. Well, by nightfall on that day, hundreds of men on both sides were dead, and nearly 2,000 from both sides were wounded. And that's why it was really the only major engagement from Florida, including these guys. If you look closely, you can see that this is the 54th Massachusetts, the same group of guys for whom the movie Glory was made. The 54th Massachusetts was America's first black regiment. Well, the Yankees were beaten pretty badly on that occasion because they were surprised, and they quickly retreated to Jacksonville as soon as they could. And as a result of the outcome, Southern supplies, while they lasted, continued to flow north without interruption. This is where it would be on I-10. This is the sign that you would see for the Olustee battlefield. And that is the railroad that still exists today at Olustee Station. And it is this railroad that the Union was trying to cut, and they just weren't able to do it. Skirmishes followed after Olustee in places like Gainesville and Cedar Key, minor battles, and Natural Bridge, which is just south of here, 10 miles south of Tallahassee. What were they doing at Natural Bridge? Why was the Union at Natural Bridge? No, they were trying to take our capital. Just 10 miles south of here is where Natural Bridge is, but the Yankees didn't make it. They never took Tallahassee during the war. They were repelled mostly by Home Guard forces. So we sent people from Tallahassee to block their way, and the Union turned around and headed back towards St. Mark's. Well, let me have the officer's cap, I think. I'm not going to use that one. Let me have the blue officer's cap. Well, the North won the war, of course, preserving the Union. That's right. Preserving the Union, and more importantly, our place in the Union. At war's end, counting everything up, Florida had given 15,000 men to Confederate service. 30% of Floridians who participated in the war lost their lives. And in addition, about 1,200 freed slaves served in the Union Army. Well, by now, in 1865, nearly half of the population was African American, for whom freedom had come at last. And so, the Civil War was over. And Tallahassee was the only Confederate capital east of the Mississippi that had not been captured. And so, on May 10th, 1865, that's May 10th, 1865, just after the war ended, Union forces in dress blue uniforms marched down Monroe Street from Tennessee Street to the Capitol and occupied Tallahassee without opposition. This is General Edward McCook, And he came down with his troops as part of Sherman's army, and he stood on the front of the Knott House, which is only 2 blocks away from the Capitol, and he read the Emancipation Proclamation for the first time on May 20th, 1865. Because it took about 10 days to consolidate Tallahassee, the mayor, and the government, and get Florida back in the Union. The fact that our capital was taken without opposition at the conclusion of the war does not mean that everyone here simply went along peaceably. During the war, our governor at the time was John Milton. And anybody here from Milton, Florida, in Santa Rosa County? Milton is a little town just east of Pensacola, and it's named after John Milton, originally from Jackson County, who was governor at the time and a fanatic supporter for the Southern cause. He was really into it. Well, Governor Milton, when he knew that the Yankees would be coming, was not in town that day that the Yankee invaders marched through his capital. He declared from his home, death would be preferable to reunion. And with a pistol from his personal collection, he calmly committed suicide. The only governor to commit suicide in office. Yeah. Unfortunately, Florida moved slowly after the war. Although it was the least badly damaged of the southern states, it was broke, confused, and had very little at that time in the way of industry, and the farmers struggled. One representative in the House of Representatives said the world was upside down at that time. And by 1866, however, most free blacks were returning to the farms and plantations as sharecroppers, which was a ruse, or employees working for very little in the way of wages. The Florida legislature then, in probably its darkest hour, passed harsh and discriminatory laws directed against African Americans. The so-called Black Codes were a deliberate attempt by former slaveholders to reinstate the slave system. In fact, if not by law. Look at this graphic. This is a seal in the 1870s and 1880s. Look at the figure on the far right of that seal. This is an example of the KKK, which was very popular in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The U.S. Congress countered all of that by adopting the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, two very important laws that they passed to protect African Americans in Florida and the rest of the South. And those two acts were specifically designed to discipline Southern state governments. And it worked for a while, but in 1877, two-party politics essentially came to an end in Florida, and so did the presence of federal troops. What a coincidence. Democratic white conservatism is now in a position to restore the political and social values that Reconstruction had challenged. This was the era of the Florida KKK and the period of the cruel Jim Crow laws that were enacted. The failure of this part of Reconstruction would not be repaired in Florida until the second half of the 20th century. Anybody know who this is? No, I'll tell you, I don't think you're going to guess. But I have to give out some candy now, don't I? Vanderbilt? Not Flagler? No. Calm down. Who? Shortly thereafter, Florida's industrial growth spurt started. Once we hit this late 1870s and into the 1880s, we had a huge growth spurt, just like everywhere in America. And it started here in Florida with the election of one of Florida's most widely acclaimed governors in 1880. And this was his hat. His name was William D. Bloxham, and he was governor actually twice on two different occasions. He was governor, and then he wasn't governor, and then he was governor again. Bloxham very cleverly solved two problems in just one move. And this is why he was most widely acclaimed as being a successful governor. First, to cover Florida's mounting debt, Bloxham sold 4 million acres of land for just 25 cents an acre. 25 cents an acre. Imagine. We're talking the 1870s. It was a deal, Florida thought. That's a great deal. It spurred massive development, and the buyers of what was considered mostly worthless land were almost all railroad men, like Henry Flagler, Henry Plant, and William Chipley. In 10 years would build 2,500 miles of rail. In just 10 years. And begin to fully develop Florida north and south, east to west. The railroad would bring visitors and investors to Florida because people came here for two reasons: for climate and opportunity. And let me tell you, in 1885, there was plenty of opportunity. William Chipley was Chipley, Florida. Anybody here happen to be from Chipley? Jackson, Holmes County? Well, there's a city over there named Chipley, and it was named for the former mayor of Pensacola, William Chipley, who connected the Panhandle with the rest of Florida. Henry B. Plant, a Yankee from Connecticut, connected the port of Tampa with the port of Jacksonville. Now, to attract people to Tampa, Plant built the Tampa Bay Hotel. Now it's the University of Tampa's administration building. When he built the hotel, it cost $3 million, which was outrageous at the time. But it was really swanky. It was one of the first hotels to have an elevator, electric lights, and it had telephones. A really special place that really attracted some attention. Well, let me just say a word about this before we move on. This hotel was specifically chosen by Plant to be an art piece. And so he chose an architect to build it with this design. Anybody know what design, where this might have come from? Moscow. No, that's not true. Did I hear Moorish? Okay, right there. Come get a bucket. Right. This is Moorish architecture, and he didn't design it with this in mind because, he liked Arab architecture or Moorish architecture. He chose it because he thought it was really pretty. Now, because his train ran across the middle of the state, he was able to fully develop the citrus industry. This video is a little bit of downtown Tampa. And what it's going to show you is the proximity of the University of Tampa, their administration building, the former Tampa Bay Hotel in downtown. It's right downtown. It's really spectacular, and you should go there if you ever visit the Tampa area. So the orange industry started moving its fruit from Tampa to Jacksonville by train on Plant's rails to ports all up and down the east coast of the United States. The orange, which is the cornerpiece of Florida's agribusiness, was actually brought to this country by the Spanish in St. Augustine. Well, by the time Florida became a state, the area was producing 2 million oranges per year. and 4 million, or twice as many, by the year 1900. Today, there are something like 80 million orange trees in Florida. So by 1885, with Florida already a major world supplier of oranges, the idea of moving the harvest by train to cities up and down the coastline and other ports was a pretty big deal. Now this picture right here I thought was pretty interesting because this is 1885, and this couple that you see here on the left, they're picking fruit, and look at their faces. They just don't look very happy with what's going on compared to the girl in the photo next to them from the 1950s. That picture was used to promote our citrus industry. Now, at the same time Plant was building commerce in Florida, on the East Coast, one of Florida's all-time most flamboyant and successful characters was also building a railroad. Henry Flagler. And this is his hat. Although they did not know each other very well, they knew each other well enough because they both used to live on Fifth Avenue in New York, not very far from each other. Because each of them was building a railroad and they wanted to keep track of the other's progress. At one point, Henry Plant was bold enough to send a message to Flagler, which read in part, "You're invited to visit us here at our new hotel here in Tampa." And Flagler wired back, "Well, I accept your invitation and I look forward to visiting with you. Where is Tampa?" Well, Flagler was joking, of course. He knew perfectly well where Tampa was. And even though he was joking, this greatly offended Plant and spurred more development in Tampa Bay area and south because he wanted to stay ahead of Flagler. Flagler, the newcomer, really didn't know very much about the Tampa Bay area or anything on the west side of Florida. And that was why their rivalry was so intense. Now, this map right here shows 4 major rails. On the north, you see that orange line. That's Chipley's Railroad from Pensacola to Jacksonville. And then the next one is David Levy Yulee's, and you can see that connects Cedar Key because he was harvesting cedar trees to make pencils, and so he built a railroad to go from Fernandina Beach to Cedar Key so he could ship cedar to the north. And then we have the blue line, which is Henry Plant. And then lastly, that red line on the east coast of Florida, that's Flagler. Chipley, Plant, Yulee, and Flagler changed everything in Florida. Henry Morrison Flagler was one of the most celebrated railroad magnates of his time. Already having made his fortune in oil with John D. Rockefeller, he moved to Florida and built the magnificent Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine. After all, he thought, if Henry Plant could build his own hotel, I could build mine. It's now the home of Flagler College. There, he built the first leg of his railroad from Jacksonville to St. Augustine, a very short distance at first. His aim, like Plant's, was to bring northerners to his hotel to enjoy our beautiful winter climate. The hotel was completed in 1888, and tourists, or strangers as they were known back then, began to pour in on a regular basis. And each train load brought new strangers. And let me tell you something, his hotel in St. Augustine, the Ponce de Leon Hotel, was really something. It was a place that was the hottest travel spot in the world for a while. For the next 25 years, everybody wanted to go there. It became a mecca for affluent and important travelers, including 4 presidents of that era who stayed there. So by 1894, Flagler had extended his rails all the way to Palm Beach and built 2 more large luxury hotels in Palm Beach. Those of you from Palm Beach will recognize the Breakers and the Royal Poinciana, which are still there. Now, with people traveling up and down the East Coast, what do you suppose started to happen to the population of the area? It doubled again in a 10-year period. We keep doubling the population in a 10-year period. But Flagler wasn't quite finished yet. He did the impossible. Let's go back to the winter of 1894, the winter of 1894. That winter was particularly brutal here in Florida. It brought severely damaging freezes to all parts of the state, except for the tiny pioneer village known as Miami. Now, because Miami did not freeze, developers Julia Tuttle, those of you from Miami or Fort Lauderdale will recognize this name. There's a Julia Tuttle Bridge connecting Miami with Miami Beach. And William Brickell of Miami, hence Brickell Avenue, one of the premier roads in downtown Miami. Both those people, Tuttle and Brickell, were developers, and they wanted to prove that Miami had some value, even though there were no roads and no trails and certainly no rails to get to Miami. You had to get there by boat. They figured that maybe somebody might want to grow something down there, or maybe somebody someday might want to visit. Oh boy, were they right. Well, Flagler was considering extending his rails from Palm Beach to Miami. What's the point, he thought. It was a very difficult chore because it was all swamp. But one gesture from Mrs. Tuttle convinced him to move right away. Mrs. Tuttle sent Flagler an orange blossom cutting in dampened cotton to demonstrate that the freeze had not touched Miami. And Flagler said, well, maybe we ought to go ahead and extend down there then. He investigated whether it was possible, but it was a very clever marketing move by Tuttle and Brickell to send him that orange blossom cutting, and it worked. So, in April of 1896, with just 300 settlers looking on, which was the population of Miami at the time, just 300 people living in a bunch of shacks down there because you couldn't get anything down there because you could only get there by boat. 300 settlers watched the first train chug in to the village of Miami. Well, Flagler was on that train and he got off and he looked around at the tiny, sparse surroundings, and with a first impression after looking around, he sighed, regretting already what he had done, and said, well, I don't think this will ever be anything more than just a fishing village. Who would have thought that this tiny village would grow up to have a population of 3.5 million people in the surrounding area, become an international metropolis, Florida's most recognized city, and stand at the center of Latin American banking? Who would have predicted that? No one. But that's what happened. You see, before Flagler's railroad arrived in Miami, you just couldn't get to Miami-Dade. Miami wasn't incorporated as a city until 1905, making it the youngest of America's big cities. There was no way in at the time and no way out except by boat. And before the railroad, to get mail from Palm Beach to points in what is now Fort Lauderdale and Miami, we actually had a barefoot mailman who walked on the beach, 3 days down there, 3 days back to deliver the mail. Well, the railroad changed all of that, of course, improving communication as well as commercial and agricultural opportunities. Flagler would later say that the crowning achievement of his life was not getting to Miami, but was the extension of his railroad all the way down to Key West. You think getting from Palm Beach to Miami was difficult. It took 12 years to complete the railroad from Miami to Key West, and many men lost their lives building that extension. 42 bridges over water and 128 extra miles of rail over water. Impossible! Well, the first train to Key West rolled in on January the 22nd, 1912. January 22nd, 1912. A long time between Palm Beach and Key West. It took much longer than they thought. January 22nd, 1912 is when Flagler first entered Key West. Just imagine the engineering and the effort it must have taken, not to mention the risk and the money to undertake such a project back in the early 1900s. You see the blue arrow in this picture? If you look very closely, that blue arrow points to Flagler as his train arrives in Key West. What an incredible feeling of accomplishment he must have had. Well, Tampa grew up too, of course, and by the time we got to the turn of the century, towards 1900, the city was considered a major, thriving community, just like everything on the East Coast was exploding. And for a time, Tampa housed 23,000 soldiers right before the Spanish Civil War, including these guys pictured here. Who are they? They were Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and his famed Rough Riders, who were anxious to get down there because they wanted to get to Cuba as soon as possible. And they knew that they were capable of doing some real damage to the Spanish. His Rough Riders embarked at the port of Tampa for Cuba and the Spanish-American War. Now look closely at these guys in the picture. This is the summer of 1898 in Tampa, one of the hottest summers they've ever had there. So note the heavy uniforms made for the North and the West, which is where most of them trained. It was ridiculously hot there for the enlisted men, while the officers enjoyed the cool breeze on the porch of Plant's mighty hotel. And if you look closely, that's the Tampa Bay Hotel there in the background. Well, the Rough Riders spent almost 2 months there waiting to be transported by ship to Santiago, Cuba. They were really getting impatient. But what was holding them up? They were waiting for enough room on the ships to take their horses. Well, in the end, they left most of their horses in Tampa. They didn't even take them. There was no room, and they didn't have time. They wanted to get down there. Everybody wanted them down there. And so, you've seen pictures of them already, I'm sure, sometime in your life, storming up San Juan Hill, but they did it on foot. They didn't have their horses. Only the officers, including Roosevelt, had their horses. The 20th century started with some problems for Florida. One series of problems after another in the early 20th century, mostly growing pains and housing, managing our growth, something we're still dealing with today. And then this disaster struck right after the turn of the century. What happened? It was a fire. But it wasn't just any fire. Look at this picture. A factory fire in downtown Jacksonville swept through the streets on the afternoon of May 3rd, 1901, devastating the entire area. The wind was blowing, and one resident said the flames moved from building to building faster than a man could walk. So by nightfall, Jacksonville was burned to the ground. Think of it. Florida's largest city at the time burned to the ground. 10,000 people left homeless on May 3rd, 1901. It's a lot of people for that era. Well, the Jacksonville fire of 1901 is famous for being the most devastating fire ever to hit a southern city. Devastating because it wiped out everything we had there. There were also fires in other cities that may have been even bigger, including Atlanta. But it wasn't as devastating to a community as was the fire of Jacksonville of 1901. It wasn't until 2 decades later, in 1919, that a sparkling new downtown with skyscrapers made with steel and concrete had arisen from the ashes. So now, in the early 1900s, we had some pretty famous governors, and I want to tell you about 2 of them in particular, very quickly. The first is a name you'll all recognize. This is Broward's hat, his inauguration hat. Now, I'm sure you'll all recognize that name. Modern Florida officially began with the election of a guy, and get this name, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. He's easy to remember. He was elected in 1904, and he was elected for 1 term, but he did a lot. He was a very large man, and he had a great name, and so he became very famous very quickly, and he was also the former sheriff of Duval County, which is how he got elected. Well, history treats Broward as one of our most successful governors, who, unlike most of his predecessors, espoused the cause of the common man and brought progressive politics to Florida. Progressive, moving forward. In his 1 term, Broward called for compulsory education. He called for the regulation of child labor, fish and game conservation laws, and his philosophies and programs were carried on by 2 governors after him, Governors Gilchrist and Governor Trammell. Public utilities were initiated in almost every town of more than 500 during this time. And now each of these towns pretty much had electricity. Major improvements. Broward is also remembered as the governor who drained part of the Everglades on the East Coast to permit settlement of the southern part of the state. Now, draining part of the Everglades would be controversial today, but it made sense in 1904 because no one could move around and they couldn't develop anything. Swampland. Now, modern day, 7.2 million people live in Palm Beach or Broward or Miami-Dade County. 1 out of every 3 Floridians lives in one of those 3 counties: Palm Beach, Broward, Miami-Dade. And now it's a top 10 megalopolis, all former swampland. It now ranks number 7 as the largest metropolis in the United States. This picture was taken of Broward and his family while he was governor. Broward and his wife had 8 daughters. And if you look at this picture, you can count them up. The other governor I want to tell you about is not really as well known in history. He was a pretty funny guy, though. He had a peculiar personality and unusual traits. I just want to show you this picture. Sidney J. Katz. Sidney J. Katz was elected governor in 1916, and this picture tells his whole story. I'll tell you what it says on the side of the car in just a second. You see, when he was elected governor, there were only 13,000 cars in the whole state. Think about that. only 13,000 cars. And primitive cars at the time, really. I mean, compared to now, in the whole state. Sidney Katz needed a gimmick to get elected as governor. So he chose his car. So he decorated this old Model T Ford, mounted a loudspeaker on the back, and campaigned up and down the state from his car. Now, he didn't do a whole lot as governor, but he did a couple of things that were really important. But everyone said his campaign sure was fun. So he'd drive this car up and down the state. And he'd drive it into a town, drive it into the town square usually, crank up his loudspeaker, and make colorful remarks to people who were at first curious and then got a little closer, more enthusiastic, and then eventually even gained fanatic supporters. And he'd end his speeches by swinging 2 loaded revolvers in the air to impress the crowd. And he'd roar, "The Florida Cracker has only 3 friends, God Almighty, Sears Roebuck, and Sidney J. Katz." The crowd loved it. They roared. And then, while they were still cheering, off he'd go. He'd shut down his speaker, get his driver in the car, and he'd head off to the next town square. But he left a lasting memory that people voted for him in droves. And then he'd go off. This picture was taken during his inaugural parade in Tallahassee. That's him there in the back seat, and the sign on the side of the car says, "This is the Ford that got me there." And he was pretty proud of that. It's a great story of how you can use a car to get elected. Before long, thank you, World War I ended. Boys came home from World War I. And what do you suppose happened to the population during the Roaring '20s? It doubled again. Where are we going to put all these people? The population doubled again, now with double-tracked railroads and good roads all the way to places like Homestead and Naples and Fort Myers. People started to discover Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Hialeah, Cape Coral, Boca Raton, places like that, places that were non-existent just 20 years before. South Florida finally became a pretty swinging place, complete with gangsters and illegal alcohol. In downtown Miami in 1925, there was a feeding frenzy of property buying just 8 miles west of Miami. Those of you familiar with Miami-Dade, and we're talking real Florida wilderness at the time, George Merrick was selling lots in Coral Gables for $29,000 a lot. Adjusted for inflation, that would be $350,000 for an undeveloped piece of real property in the middle of nowhere in western Dade County. At the time in western Dade, this was 1925, that price was just unheard of. But they were selling like hotcakes. And this picture was taken in 1925 at the height of the land boom in 1925. Just 10 years earlier, Carl Fisher, you might recognize Fisher Island next to Miami Beach. Carl Fisher on Miami Beach was giving away beachfront property to anyone who would promise to develop it. Fisher was in the development business too. So he gave away the property if people would just put something on it. 20 years before that picture, Miami didn't even exist. It was amazing how the growth had developed. By 1926, 2.5 million people lived in Florida, and the population doubled again. They mostly lived on farms at the time, though. You see, Florida has always been a pretty rural state, and it wasn't until 1940 that most people actually lived in a town or a city. The boom didn't last long in South Florida, and just as quickly as developers made money, they lost it, and building slowed down for a while. And then another Florida disaster came along. What was it this time? I heard hurricane way over there. Come get a bucket. I'm going to leave you in some suspense at the end of this. It was a major hurricane that hit the Gold Coast between Miami and Fort Lauderdale in September of 1926. A major hurricane, the first to devastate Miami and Fort Lauderdale, hit in September of 1926 with winds packing 150 miles an hour, a very strong storm. The ocean swept over Miami Beach and into downtown Miami. 400 people were killed almost instantly, and 6,000 people in Dade County were wounded. Now, why was that? Why were so many killed? Well, that's right. First of all, they didn't know it was coming. They didn't have Doppler radar. They didn't know what was coming. And because they didn't have a building code that suited the needs. And so everything was wiped out. And when it was over, 18,000 people from Miami to Okeechobee were left homeless. It's a lot of people. As news spread north, traveling south to Miami stopped as visitors from the north wondered if Miami would ever be rebuilt. Why bother, they thought. One Coconut Grove survivor, which is in downtown Miami, told the Miami News, quote, "That storm blowed a crooked road straight and scattered the days of the week so bad that Sunday didn't get around here until Tuesday morning." Here is a picture of modern-day South Beach, the way it looked on the morning after that hurricane in 1926. Everything that Tuttle, Merrick, Fisher, and Brickell had built was gone. And they wondered if Miami would ever get rebuilt. Well, Miami did get rebuilt. I'll stop there until the next season begins on the Florida History Show, where we'll get through World War II, some major hurricanes, the 50s and the 60s, all coming up on the Florida History Show next episode. Until then, bye-bye.